Hello, and welcome back to Creepy Chronicles. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I love reading every single one. If you enjoy Creepy Chronicles filled with spine-chilling horror, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now get comfortable. Dim the lights if you dare. Relax your mind. Let the outside world fade away. And let's begin. Story 1, Miss Juro, was one of those women everyone in the neighborhood seemed to respect, even if nobody really understood her. She had been there longer than almost anyone else, long enough that people stopped thinking of her as just another neighbor and started treating her like part of the street itself. Families moved in, raised children, moved away, and were replaced by new families. But Miss Euro remained in the same old house, number 405. My house was number 404. That meant I saw more of her than most people did. Her place had probably looked nearly the same for decades. The porch boards were dry and worn, bending slightly in the middle from years of rain and heat. Homemade protection charms hung from the windows, doors, porch railings, and even the branches of the small trees around her yard. Some looked religious. Others looked like things she had invented herself. There were bundles of dried herbs tied with red thread, little metal shapes, strings of beads, feathers, tiny glass bottles, and pieces of paper folded into strange symbols. Every spring, tulips completely took over her garden. They came up in thick groups, red, yellow, white, and purple, covering almost every open patch of ground like an army. By the start of summer, they would die off, and the lawn would be left pale, dry, and damaged underneath them. Nobody really knew what Miss Neuro's life had been like before she moved onto our block. Most people did not even know exactly when she had arrived. As far as the neighborhood was concerned, she had simply always been there. I could not ignore her strange habits as easily as everyone else. Living directly beside someone changes the way you see them. Even if you barely speak, their life becomes part of yours. You notice when their lights are on. You notice when they stop cutting the grass. You know when they have guests. You know when something breaks because you hear the repairman outside. I saw Miss Zero every time I looked out of my kitchen window. I saw her every time I stepped onto my porch. Sometimes I saw her standing completely still in her yard before sunrise, looking up at the sky. Her house also had a smell. It was difficult to describe exactly. It smelled like some kind of strong cleaning chemical, maybe bleach mixed with something sweeter. I never learned where it came from. The smell was so constant that I eventually assumed it had soaked into the walls and wooden frame of the house. Even when she opened her windows during spring, the same sharp scent remained. Whenever I passed her on the sidewalk, Miss Euro waved. Her lips were always painted a dark plum red, almost the color of wine, and when she smiled, the expression looked bigger than the emotion behind it. It was not that she disliked me. I do not think she disliked anyone. But she also never seemed especially happy to see me. Her mind always appeared to be somewhere else. Sometimes I thought she was thinking about another town. Sometimes another country. Sometimes, watching her stare into the sky, I honestly wondered if her thoughts were even on Earth. If I had to choose a year when her behavior became more noticeable, I would say 2012. I could be wrong about that. I did not know her well enough before then to compare. But 2012 was the first time I remember the whole neighborhood talking seriously about her. That year, she became convinced that something terrible was coming. She contacted one contractor after another, then another, then another. Eventually, workers arrived and began tearing apart her backyard. At first, everyone thought she was installing a pool. Then we saw how deep they were digging. It was an underground shelter, not a small storm cellar either. For weeks, trucks came and went. Concrete was poured. Pipes were installed. Metal doors arrived. Workers dug so much that almost the entire backyard disappeared. Miss Euro stood outside every morning, supervising them. I once asked one of the workers how large the shelter was. He shrugged and said he did not know the final measurements, but it was one of the strangest private jobs he had ever worked on. By early fall, the shelter was finished. After that, Miss Euro started buying supplies. She drove to supermarkets and warehouse stores several times a week. Each time she came home, her trunk was packed with bags, boxes, water containers, canned food, batteries, medical kits, and blankets. I helped her carry some of it inside once. She had enough rice to feed a family for months, maybe longer. During October and November, her mood changed. She became quieter. I would see her walking around her yard with the expression of someone who had already lost something. One afternoon, she invited me inside and showed me a large book filled with pressed flowers and leaves. An herbarium, she said. She had collected samples from trees, flowers, weeds, and even ordinary lawn grass. To remember them, she told me. Remember them from what? She smiled. After, I did not ask what she meant. On December 20th, she went from house to house saying goodbye. Not dramatic goodbyes. That almost made it worse. She simply knocked on doors, wished everyone well, thanked them for being good neighbors, and told them she hoped they had peaceful lives. Some people laughed about it. Others were uncomfortable. She came to my door last. Well, she said, it has been nice living beside you. You're moving? No. Then she gave me that same wide wine-colored smile. Take care of yourself. For the next 5 days, her house was silent. No lights, no movement, no curtains opening. Nothing. On Christmas morning, the front door opened. Miss Zuro walked outside wearing a thick sweater and slippers. She looked around. Then she breathed out deeply. Later that afternoon, I saw her drinking tea on the porch. I walked over. So? She looked embarrassed for maybe 3 seconds. Then she shrugged. Better to be prepared for things like that. That was another strange thing about her. Miss Euro was never angry when she was wrong. She never blamed the people who had made the prediction. She never said the government had changed the date. She never invented excuses. She simply accepted that disaster had not happened and moved on to the next possible disaster. And there was always another one. In 2013, she reacted to the Boston Marathon bombing as if it proved the world was becoming unstable. In 2014, she became obsessed with the blood moon. In 2016, she spent weeks talking about political violence after conservatives won major elections. In 2017, the hurricanes convinced her to buy emergency water filters and inflatable boats. In 2018, when George H.W. Bush died, she talked constantly about political cycles, symbols, and the meaning of former presidents dying. Then came 2020. Everyone knew what happened that year. For the first time, Miss Euro's habit of storing food and supplies did not seem completely ridiculous. While shelves emptied and people fought over basic products, she already had everything. She even offered supplies to neighbors. That was something I respected about her. Whatever else could be said about Miss Euro, she was generous. She never wanted to survive alone. If she believed something bad was coming, she warned everyone. She would offer water, food, batteries, blankets, medicine. If someone refused, she did not get offended. She simply offered again later. Sometimes I wondered where all her money came from. She did not appear to have a normal job. Still, she always had enough for another project, another renovation, another delivery, another strange piece of equipment. By 2023, most people had stopped paying attention when she announced the end of the world. That was the year she approached me with her strangest prediction yet. I was taking the trash out when I saw her hurrying down the sidewalk toward me. She was wearing gardening gloves and one slipper. "The Earth is about to get hit by a meteor," she announced. I stared at her. "Okay, nothing will survive." She nodded once. I had learned over the years that arguing with her was pointless, not because she became angry, because she did not. She would listen carefully to whatever you said, thank you, then continue believing exactly what she believed before. "How big is the rock?" I asked. Mostly, I was trying to be polite. She kept walking. "We'll all die. I'm gathering people this evening to show it." Then she hurried away. That evening, I went. Nobody else did. I was not surprised. The neighborhood had heard too many predictions by then. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I had been inside her house several times. It was always clean and quiet, almost too clean. Every room contained pieces of her life, old photographs, books with cracked spines, furniture that had clearly been repaired many times instead of replaced, small religious objects, boxes of newspaper clippings, strange collections of stones and dried plants. Years of history seemed packed into every corner. She took me upstairs. In her bedroom stood a telescope. It was not very large, the kind an enthusiastic hobbyist might buy after reading about astronomy online. She had pointed it toward the sky through an open window. "Look," I bent down and looked through the lens. Blackness, a few stars. Nothing unusual. I moved slightly. Still nothing. "So?" She pointed upward. "That spot is darker." I looked again. "What spot?" "There, all of it is dark." "No," she sounded almost disappointed in me. "That spot is darker than the rest." I stared for another few seconds. "I don't see it." "You will." She smiled sadly. "It will become more visible each day." I stepped away from the telescope. "Where did you hear about this?" "Nowhere." That answer surprised me. She touched the telescope gently. "I was playing with my nephew's telescope when he visited." She paused. "I saw it myself." "You discovered a meteor?" "Yes. Did you tell anyone?" "I wrote to space magazines." I almost laughed. She saw my expression. "Don't worry. I'm not worried." "You will be." Over the following weeks, her house changed again. Builders arrived. This time, they worked in the attic. A section of the roof was removed and replaced with large glass panels, creating a kind of homemade observatory. Then a professional telescope was delivered. This one was huge, much larger than the telescope in her bedroom. Every night, I could see her through the attic glass. She would sit in a soft armchair for hours, staring through the telescope. Sometimes until sunrise. She became increasingly distant. She stopped going on her usual walks. She stopped talking to neighbors. She stopped taking care of the yard. The grass grew high enough that the city eventually sent her a warning. She did not seem to care. I visited her again several weeks later. She opened the door quickly, as if she had been expecting me. The chemical smell inside was stronger than usual. How is it progressing? I asked. She smiled. It's almost here. You still believe that? I think it will arrive Friday. She said this with complete calm. No fear, no excitement. She might as well have been telling me about rain. We went upstairs. The new telescope was aimed almost straight upward. I sat down while she made tea. It was some kind of strong herbal mix. I took one sip and burned my tongue. You can look if you want, she said. It is very visible now. I looked toward the telescope. For some reason, I did not want to. I believe you. You shouldn't. What? You should see things yourself. I'm fine. She studied me. Then she sat down across from me. So how big is it? I asked. Large enough to destroy the planet. I laughed once. She did not. Then she added, but I think it is aimed at our town. That made me stop smiling. You think something 20 kilometers wide is aiming for this neighborhood? Yes, a meteor cannot aim. She lifted her eyebrows. Are you sure it is a meteorite? I asked. Yes. She stood and walked toward a small table. She returned carrying several pieces of crumpled paper. I've been drawing it. She handed them to me. At first, the drawings looked meaningless. Circles, jagged shapes, curved lines, dark patches. The pages had clearly been worked on many times. Some pencil marks were faint. Others were fresh and dark. It looked like she had added more details every night. It is around 20 kilometers across, she said. I looked at the page. The ground of it is green. The surface? She nodded. I thought it might be copper. She pointed at several areas. The surface is uneven. That was true even in the drawing. There were bumps, pits, towers, holes, and strange ridges. The more I looked, the less it resembled a rock. Some shapes looked almost organic. I pointed to several thin forms near the edge. What are these? Miss Juro leaned closer. Hands on rocks. I looked at her. What? These are hands on rocks. She pointed to another section. These are rocks on top of hands. I said nothing. She moved her finger across the page. Other formations. I stared at the shapes. They have different ways to watch. I slowly lowered the paper. Silence filled the room. For once, I did not know whether to joke, argue, or simply leave. Her face had changed. There was a softness in her expression, almost happiness. What exactly are you saying? She looked toward the glass ceiling. They heard my prayers. My stomach tightened. Who? She smiled. They answered. I did not like the way she said it. Answered what? My prayers. How? They said they are coming. I searched her face for any sign that she was joking. There was none. Miss Juro. Who said that? She looked at me as though the answer should have been obvious. The ones above. I stayed only a few more minutes. Before I left, she followed me to the door. You should come tomorrow evening. For what? To wait. For the meteor? She smiled. For them. Thursday came. Nothing happened. That night, the neighborhood looked completely normal. Children played outside until their parents called them in. Someone down the street grilled burgers. A dog barked for nearly an hour. Cars came home from work. Televisions glowed through windows. Miss Juro's attic light stayed on. I could see her silhouette beneath the glass roof. She was sitting beside the telescope. Waiting, I considered going over. I almost did. Then, I thought about all the other times she had been wrong. The moons, the storms, the political signs, every prophecy, every warning. I went to bed. Almost everyone else did too. And, in a way, we were right not to be nervous. Because on Friday morning, we all woke up. The world was still here. The sun had risen. There had been no earthquake, no fire in the sky, no meteor impact. I walked downstairs feeling slightly embarrassed that part of me had expected anything. I entered the kitchen. I filled the coffee machine with water. Then I looked out the window. For several seconds, my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. House 405 was gone, not damaged. Gone, I dropped the spoon I was holding. I walked closer to the window. There was open space where Miss Euro's house had stood. I ran outside. Several neighbors were already there. Someone had called the police. Someone else was crying. The morning air was cold for summer. The sun had not yet climbed high enough to warm the street. Grass glittered with moisture. Birds were singing. Everything looked painfully ordinary, except for the hole. Between House 403 and House 407 was a massive black scar. House 405 had vanished. So had most of the yard. The ground looked burned, not like a normal house fire. There were no large beams, no collapsed walls, no recognizable rooms. Almost nothing remained, just blackened soil and pale gray ash. Some of the ash lifted gently in the morning breeze. I watched it drift across the street. A few bricks stuck out of the ground. That was all. The destruction was so complete that it did not seem physically possible. A normal house fire leaves something behind. Furniture frames, pipes, appliances, metal, foundation. The underground shelter alone should have remained. Instead, there was almost nothing. The police arrived quickly. Then firefighters. Then more police. They blocked off the street. They interviewed everyone. When they spoke to me, I told them the truth. I told them about Miss Euro's prediction. I told them about the telescope. I told them about the drawings. I told them she expected something to arrive Friday. The officer interviewing me stopped writing. What exactly did she say? She said they were coming. Who? I don't know. He stared at me for a long time. I could tell he thought I was either lying or crazy. Then he asked about explosives, gas leaks, enemies, illegal chemicals. I had no answers. Later that morning, unfamiliar vehicles arrived. People wearing protective clothing walked around the site carrying equipment I had never seen before. I assumed they were scientists. They took samples. They photographed everything. They measured the hole. A few of them spent a long time staring upward. By afternoon, they were gone. No explanation. No public statement. Nothing. The police stayed another day. Then they slowly disappeared too. For weeks, yellow tape remained around the property. Neighbors talked about it constantly at first. Some blamed a gas explosion. Some said the underground shelter collapsed. Others believed Miss Neuro had planned it and escaped. Nobody could explain where the remains of the house went. Nobody could explain why the houses on either side had almost no damage. Nobody could explain why there had been no loud explosion. I had slept less than 30 feet away. I heard nothing. That disturbed me more than anything. A blast powerful enough to erase a house should have shattered every window on the block. Instead, my kitchen window was untouched. People eventually stopped talking about it. That is what neighborhoods do. Life keeps moving. The burned lot remained empty. Grass slowly began growing around the edges. House prices dipped for a while. Then new people moved in nearby and asked what had happened. We usually gave them the easy answer. Fire, accident, something like that. But I never believed it. A few days after the police stopped watching the property, I went outside late at night. I stood beside the fence, separating my yard from what had once been hers. The sky was clear. I found myself looking up. For the first time, I tried to remember exactly where Miss Juro had aimed the telescope, directly above, almost vertical. I stared at the stars. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then I thought about what she had told me months earlier. That spot is darker. I searched the sky. Maybe imagination created it. Maybe I wanted to see it, because she had planted the idea in my mind. Still, there seemed to be one section above the block where the stars looked wrong. Not gone, covered as if something dark had passed between us and them. I watched for nearly an hour. The shape did not move. Eventually, I went inside. I told myself it was a cloud. There were no clouds that night. A week later, I found something in my mailbox. No envelope, no stamp, just a folded piece of paper. I almost threw it away before I noticed the pencil marks. My hands went cold. It looked exactly like one of Miss Euro's drawings. A rough circle filled with strange ridges, pits, hands, rocks, and shapes that seemed to make less sense the longer I stared. But this drawing had more detail than the ones she showed me. Much more. There were buildings, tiny rectangles, streets, a row of houses. I recognized the curve of our block. I found number 404, my house. Beside it was a blank space where 405 had been. Above the drawing were 3 words written in Miss Juro's handwriting. They heard you. I stood inside my doorway for a long time. Then I turned the page over. Something else was written on the back. Very small, almost hidden. Do not pray. I still live at house 404. I have considered moving many times. I probably should. But whenever I start looking at new places, I remember Miss Zuro's shelter, her supplies, her tulips, her protection charms, her belief that preparation was never wasted. I understand her better now. Every spring I plant tulips along the edge of my yard, not because I particularly like them, because she did. I also kept the drawing. I know that sounds stupid. Sometimes I unfold it and compare it with the sky. The thing above us is not there every night. At least, I do not think it is. But some nights, especially when the air is completely still, I notice the stars disappearing one by one over the neighborhood. Not flickering, not dimming, simply being covered. And on those nights, my house smells like hers. That sharp chemical scent slips through the walls, even with every window closed. Then the protection charms I copied from Miss Euro begin turning slowly on their strings, even though there is no wind. I have never prayed since receiving the note. Not once. I do not ask God for help. I do not wish for answers. I do not even speak Miss Euro's name while looking at the sky. Because if she was right about one thing, she may have been right about everything. Something hurt her. Something answered. Something crossed a distance no meteor could consciously cross. And whatever came from Miss Juro did not destroy her house by accident. It took it. Sometimes, just before sunrise, I hear something underneath the empty lot beside mine. 3 slow knocks. Then silence. I never go outside to investigate. I never answer. And I never look through a telescope. Because somewhere above house 404, there may still be a patch of sky darker than all the rest. And I have started to believe Miss Juro when she said, the strangest part. They have different ways to watch. Story 2. My story probably would have never had a place to be told if the internet did not exist. Without it, This would have remained one of those strange family secrets that people whisper about, but never say out loud. It is the kind of story you might tell around a campfire late at night, when the fire is starting to die and everyone is already nervous from the darkness around them. Even then, you would probably laugh at the end and pretend you made the whole thing up, because admitting that you believed it was real would make you look insane. For a long time, that was exactly how I felt. Then I started reading stories online. I found accounts written by people who claimed they had seen things that should not exist. They described impossibly tall figures standing between trees, watching from roadsides, appearing outside bedroom windows, or waiting silently in the background of photographs. Some of these beings had no faces. Some wore dark suits or clothing that looked strangely formal. Others had limbs that seemed too long for their bodies. Whenever I read those stories, I felt something heavy drop inside my stomach. It was not simple fear. It was recognition. The details were never exactly the same, but they were close enough to something I had been carrying around for years. Other people had apparently seen strange beings, too. Some had survived terrifying encounters and lived long enough to tell others what happened. Finding those people gave me a kind of comfort I never expected. For the first time, I began to wonder if maybe believing my family's story did not make me completely crazy. Maybe there were things in the world that we did not understand. Maybe what happened to my great-grandfather was not just the imagination of a troubled man. I should make one thing clear before going further. This is not really my story. I am not the main character in what I am about to tell you. At best, I am only the person passing it along. The real story belonged to my great-grandfather. After his death, a journal was found among his possessions. For years, it passed quietly through different members of the family. Some people believed what was written inside. Others treated it like fiction. A few refused to discuss it at all. Eventually, it came to me. I have read that journal more times than I can count. At first, I thought the strange things inside were simply the work of an imaginative man who desperately wanted to become a writer. He even admitted that ambition in the journal itself. But the more I read, the harder it became to dismiss everything. Some entries felt too personal, too frightened, too confused. And then there were certain details that reminded me strongly of the stories I later discovered online. Tall figures, unnatural bodies, things hiding in the woods, creatures that children could apparently see when adults could not. That was when I decided I needed to share what he wrote. I still do not know exactly why I am doing this. Maybe I want people to be aware that something like this happened. Maybe I want to honor my great-grandfather, though after reading the entire journal, I am still not sure whether he deserves to be honored. Maybe I simply want someone else to carry the weight of this story with me. There is also something strangely attractive about telling a frightening story that has been trapped in your family for generations. Maybe I just need to get it out of my head. It is probably a mixture of all those reasons. The journal itself is long, and I doubt I can share everything at once. Life does not give me much free time, and these entries deserve more attention than a rushed summary. So, I decided to begin with the earliest part, where my great-grandfather first explained why he had started writing everything down. The first important entry was dated June 28th, 1922. He began by explaining that the journal would have more than one purpose. Most importantly, he wanted to record the strange behavior of his youngest son, James Barclay. He also wanted to practice writing. My great-grandfather dreamed of becoming a serious author. He mentioned writers like Fitzgerald and Woolf and admitted that his own dream probably sounded foolish. He knew that he had a habit of using too many beautiful words and dramatic descriptions, but he considered the journal a place where he could improve. That explained why even his private thoughts sometimes read like a novel. But beneath all the fancy language was something much simpler. He was afraid of his son. He never wrote those exact words at first. He tried to avoid them. He called James unusual, different, strange, troubling. But the fear was obvious. My great-grandfather wrote that he did not want to take James to any kind of doctor who studied the mind. He distrusted such people and feared what they might do to a child who behaved differently. This was 1922, after all. Medical treatment for mental problems could be cruel, and my great-grandfather imagined terrible procedures being performed on his son. He was afraid someone might damage James permanently while trying to cure him. So instead of going to a doctor, he started writing everything down. James had always been strange. Even his birth had been unusual. My great-grandfather had not been there when James was born because he had been called away to Europe during the final years of the Great War. Everything he knew about the birth came from his wife, Melendra, according to her. James nearly killed her simply by being born. The labor had been long and difficult. For a while, the doctor believed either the mother or the baby might die. When James finally came into the world, he was not pink and screaming like a normal newborn. He was gray. His skin looked almost lifeless. He did not move much. More worrying than that, he did not cry. The doctor held him and struck his back again and again, trying to force air into the baby's lungs. For several horrifying moments, nothing happened. Then James breathed. His chest moved. His color slowly improved. He lived. But even after air entered his lungs, he did not cry. That detail became more disturbing as he grew older. According to the journal, nobody ever saw James cry. Not once. Children cry over everything. They cry when they fall. They cry when they scrape their knees. They cry when they become frightened. They cry when their parents shout at them. They cry because another child takes a toy. They cry because they are tired, hungry, angry, or simply overwhelmed. James did none of those things. When he hurt himself, he only stared at the injury. When he was punished, he remained quiet. If another child upset him, he did not shout or complain. There were no tears. At first, the family treated this as another unusual part of his personality. My great-grandfather convinced himself that every child was different. Perhaps James was simply unusually calm. Perhaps he experienced pain differently. Perhaps he was sensitive in ways that were not easy to see. Over time, my great-grandfather learned to accept other odd behaviors too. During gatherings with other children, James rarely played. While the rest of them ran around the yard, chased one another, shouted, fought, and laughed, James usually sat somewhere alone. Sometimes he would play quietly with a toy. Sometimes he would simply watch. His silence also worried the family. James could speak. That was important. He understood language and could answer when he chose to. He simply seemed to dislike talking. Tutors had worked with him, but nothing changed very much. His silence was not caused by an inability to form words. It seemed to be a choice. Still, my great-grandfather kept finding reasons to accept it. He built what he described as a kind of safe boundary in his own mind. James was strange, yes, but James was his son. That mattered more than anything else. If his son never cried, then he would accept that. If his son preferred sitting alone instead of playing, he would accept that too. If James barely spoke, then the family would simply learn to live with the quiet. My great-grandfather seems to have worked very hard to convince himself that nothing was truly wrong. He loved his son and believed love should be stronger than discomfort. Then something happened that destroyed the safe explanation he had built. It began with James disappearing. The Barclay family lived on a large piece of property with a house surrounded by open land, a small creek, and woods farther out. One afternoon, Melinda realized she could not find James. At first, nobody panicked. There were other children in the house, and it was possible James was hiding somewhere or had gone outside. She asked the three older children if they knew where their younger brother was. None of them did. That still was not enough to cause real fear. Children wandered. Children hid. Children became distracted. Melendra searched the rooms. Then she searched again. James was not there. My great-grandfather joined her. They checked the bedrooms, the kitchen, storage spaces, and every other part of the home where a small child might have hidden. Still, nothing. The concern began to turn into panic. Melendra went through the house a second time, while my great-grandfather decided to search outside. Their property had a narrow stone bridge that crossed a small creek. Beyond that bridge stood an area of thick woodland. It was not a part of the land the family used much. Closer to the house, everything had been made comfortable. There was a meadow. There were chairs outside. There was a patio and other places where the family could sit or spend time together. Beyond the creek, there was only nature. The woods were dense. Tall, narrow trees grew close together. Bushes and tangled plants filled the spaces between them. My great-grandfather occasionally walked there when he wanted to be alone. He liked the silence. He liked the feeling of being away from the house. But it was not somewhere he expected to find his 6-year-old son by himself. That afternoon, a storm was approaching. The wind was beginning to strengthen. Dark clouds had formed overhead. The leaves moved restlessly as my great-grandfather crossed the stone bridge. He called for James. There was no answer. He continued deeper into the trees. Eventually, he saw him. James was sitting near the remains of a fallen tree. He had leaned his small body against an old stump as if he had been there for some time. The boy's thin blonde hair moved in the wind. He seemed completely calm. There was a small notebook in his hands. James was trying to keep the pages steady while drawing with a piece of charcoal. My great-grandfather felt both relief and irritation. They had been searching everywhere for him, while James had simply been sitting in the woods drawing. He approached. "What are you doing, James?" he asked. James looked up. This was the point in the journal where my great-grandfather wrote something that he clearly felt ashamed to admit. His son's eyes frightened him. He hated himself for feeling that way. These were the eyes of his own child. Yet there was something about James's gaze that made him deeply uncomfortable. He wrote that he would never admit this feeling to Melendra. He would never tell his other children. The journal was the only place where he felt safe saying it. But he also suspected the rest of the family felt something similar. He had noticed the older boys avoiding James whenever possible. He had seen his daughters touch James cautiously, patting his head almost like someone touching an animal they did not fully trust. Even Melendra sometimes looked uneasy while caring for him. James was only 6 years old. Still, his father felt uncomfortable whenever the boys stared at him. My great-grandfather described his eyes as dark and empty. He compared them to the eyes of cattle, though he immediately seemed ashamed of making the comparison. When staring into them, he did not feel the familiar sense that another person was looking back. There was no visible curiosity, no excitement, no anger, no fear. Nothing. His eyes were simply dark pools, almost black, the same color as the charcoal James was using in his notebook. When asked what he was doing, James answered calmly, "I am drawing a picture, Daddy. My great-grandfather told him that he could see that." What he really wanted to know was why James had wandered so far from the house alone. Before the boy could answer, lightning flashed across the darkening sky. Thunder followed, loud enough to cover James's first response. My great-grandfather asked him to repeat himself. James looked at him and said that one of his friends was there. They met at that spot sometimes. That answer immediately caused my great-grandfather to look around. As far as he knew, James did not have friends. Certainly not friends who came onto the family property and waited for him inside the woods. He scanned the trees. The view was difficult because the forest was thick. Slim trunks stood everywhere. Bushes crowded the ground. There were dozens of places where someone could hide. But he saw no child. He heard nobody running away. There was no movement except the trees and leaves shifting in the wind. My great-grandfather told James that they should return to the house. He added that James's friend should probably go home too, especially with a storm approaching. Then he crouched beside the boy and reached for his wrist to help him stand. That was when he finally saw the drawing. Until then, he had only noticed that James was sketching something. Now he could see the image clearly. It was not another child. James had drawn a creature. The figure was extremely tall and painfully thin. Its body almost resembled the trees surrounding them. Its arms and legs were far too long. The arms hung down beside its body, with fingers reaching almost to the knees. The hands themselves were narrow and strange. The entire thing looked stretched. But the worst part was the eyes. James had drawn eyes all over it. There were eyes across the chest, eyes on the stomach, eyes running along the arms, more eyes on the legs. There were so many that it was difficult to know where to look. The figure reminded my great-grandfather of something from a dark children's fairy tale. It looked like the kind of monster parents might invent to frighten a badly behaved child. Brush your teeth, or it will come for you. Do your chores, or it will wait outside your room. Go to sleep before dark, or it will knock on your window. Except James had not drawn the creature as something frightening. He had drawn it as someone he knew. My great-grandfather studied the picture while helping James stand. Then, trying to sound casual, he asked what the creature was supposed to be. James answered without hesitation. "That's him, Daddy, my friend." Then he asked a question that made his father feel cold. "Do you not see him?" There was no fear in James's voice, no joke, no sign that he was making up a story. He genuinely seemed surprised that his father could not see the creature. My great-grandfather admitted in the journal that looking was foolish, but he looked anyway. He searched the forest again, once, then twice. He looked between the trunks. He studied the shadows. He stared into the thick plants around them. Nothing. There was no giant creature covered in eyes. There was no person. There was nobody there except himself and James. The boy raised his hand and pointed toward their far left. "He is over there," James said. My great-grandfather followed the direction of his finger. Again, he saw only trees. Tall, thin, dark against the coming storm. Some of them were narrow enough to vaguely resemble the body James had drawn. Branches hung down like long arms. Leaves shifted in the wind. For a moment, the forest seemed different to him. Not changed exactly, just harder to understand. The more he looked, the less certain he felt about what he was seeing. Still, there was nothing that could honestly be called a creature. Nothing moved toward them. No eyes opened on the trunks. No long fingers reached through the leaves. He finally forced himself to stop staring. He must be shy, my great-grandfather said. He later admitted that he had said it mainly to calm himself. James nodded. Yes, the boy answered. He is very shy. That was where my great-grandfather ended his first entry. He wrote that he did not yet know what to do with the information. He did not know whether the drawing meant anything. He did not know whether James had invented an imaginary friend or whether something more disturbing was happening. He had hoped that writing everything down would help organize his thoughts. Instead, he felt even more confused. There was one idea, however, that he could not remove from his mind. He wanted to return to those woods. He wanted to look for James's friend. My great-grandfather admitted that he was busy. He had work. He had a family. He still dreamed of becoming a writer, and he spent whatever free time he could find practicing. He was also no longer a young man. Walking around the woods searching for a creature from a child's drawing should have seemed ridiculous. Yet James's strange behavior had awakened something in him. It was partly fear, but it was also curiosity, a dark kind of curiosity, the sort that pulls your eyes toward something horrible, even when every sensible part of your mind tells you to look away. He could not stop thinking about the picture. The long arms, the endless eyes, the tall shape standing among the thin trees. Most of all, he could not stop thinking about the way James had pointed into the woods. There had been no hesitation in the boy's movement. James had not searched around before choosing a random direction. He had looked directly at one specific place. He had pointed. He had spoken as if someone was truly standing there. My great-grandfather wrote that he replayed that moment several times after returning to the house. He remembered the storm wind moving through the trees. He remembered the distant thunder. He remembered the charcoal image in his son's notebook. And slowly, an uncomfortable thought began to take shape. What if James had not been imagining anything? What if the problem was not that the boy could see something that was not there? What if the problem was that his father could not see something that was? That possibility should have been easy to reject. Instead, it stayed with him. The rest of the evening passed normally enough. James returned home without complaint. Melinda was angry that he had wandered away, but James did not react to her anger. He simply stood there with his usual empty expression while she scolded him. He did not apologize. He did not cry. He did not defend himself. Afterward, he went about the rest of his evening as if nothing unusual had happened. But my great-grandfather could not do the same. Every time he looked through a window toward the distant tree line, he found himself remembering the drawing. At sunset, the forest became a dark wall beyond the creek. Individual trunks disappeared into shadow. There was no longer any way to tell one tree from another, at least not from the house. My great-grandfather stood near one of the windows longer than he intended. He later wrote that he was embarrassed by his own imagination. Every dark space between the trees seemed deep enough to hide someone. Every branch looked slightly too much like a thin arm. Every time the leaves moved, his attention jumped toward them. Nothing appeared. Still, he closed the curtains before night had fully arrived. He did not tell Melindra why. He also chose not to tell her exactly what James had said in the forest. As far as she knew, their youngest son had simply wandered away and been found drawing near a fallen tree. That was strange enough. There was no reason, he told himself, to frighten her with stories about a tall creature. The drawing remained with James. My great-grandfather considered taking it from him. He almost did. But something stopped him. Perhaps he did not want James to know how much it had affected him. Perhaps he wanted to see whether the boy would draw the creature again. Or perhaps, on some deeper level, he was afraid to touch the image. He did not explain exactly why. The journal entry ended with his decision still uncertain. He knew he should probably forget the entire event. Children invented imaginary companions all the time. Some children were simply quieter than others. Some children drew monsters. There was nothing supernatural about any of that. Those were the facts he tried to hold on to. But there was another fact, too. James did not behave like a child playing pretend. When he spoke about his friend, there had been no excitement, no performance, no attempt to make his father believe. He had spoken the same way a person might point toward a neighbor standing across the street. That's him, my friend. Do you not see him? That calm certainty was what disturbed my great-grandfather most. By the time he put down his pen that night, he had already begun considering another trip across the creek. He told himself it would only be an investigation, a walk through his own property, nothing more. He could examine the area in daylight. Perhaps he would discover footprints belonging to another child. Perhaps James had really met someone from a nearby family. Maybe the strange drawing had nothing to do with whoever James was meeting. There were countless reasonable explanations. My great-grandfather listed several of them in the journal, almost as if repetition could make them more convincing. Yet the final lines of that entry carried a different feeling. He wrote that the situation had awakened a morbid interest in him. That phrase stayed with me after I first read it. Morbid interest. Because that was the moment when fear stopped being enough to keep him away. Something else had begun pulling him toward the woods. He wanted answers. He wanted to know who James was speaking to. And even though he had seen nothing standing between those trees, some part of him had already started referring to the creature as if it were real. Not an imaginary friend. Not a drawing. Not a child's monster. A thing. Tall, hidden, waiting somewhere beyond the stone bridge. And according to 6-year-old James Barclay, it had already been meeting him there for some time. Story 3. The missing persons report came in on what should have been an ordinary morning. 2 young women had disappeared. Their names were Claire Tuns and Emily Hart, university students from Canada. Claire was 23. Emily was 22. Both were studying at a university in Winnipeg. According to their families, neither girl had any criminal history. Neither had problems with drugs or alcohol. They were ordinary students who had decided to take a road trip during their break. Their plan was simple. They left Winnipeg and intended to drive south through North Dakota before continuing west toward Yellowstone National Park. Along the way, they wanted to explore North Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming. They were taking photographs, stopping at small towns, and enjoying the sort of trip young people take when they have more time than money and want to see places they have only known from maps. They never reached Yellowstone. The last confirmed sighting placed them near the small town of Balta. By the time the case landed on my desk, Their families had already gone from worried to terrified. I started with the obvious places: gas stations, restaurants, motels, roadside stores. The investigation quickly confirmed that Claire and Emily had stopped at a local gas station not far from Balta. That should have been good news. A confirmed location meant a starting point. Unfortunately, the gas station had the worst security system I had ever seen. The owner had one old camera pointed toward the fuel pumps. The edge of the frame barely caught the front entrance of the store. The footage was recorded on VHS. This was 2007. The owner had one tape. One. Every day, he rewound it and recorded over the previous footage. I remember standing behind the counter and asking him whether he had any backup tapes. He stared at me like I had asked whether he owned a private helicopter. No, luckily, the footage from the day the girls stopped there had not yet been erased. Calling it footage was generous. The video looked like something recovered from the bottom of a lake. Static rolled across the screen. White lines crawled through the image. Every few seconds, the picture jumped. Sometimes, half the screen disappeared. There was no audio. Still, it gave us something. We could see the gray sedan belonging to Claire, and Emily parked near one of the pumps. At one point, Emily Hart appeared clearly enough for identification. She was getting back into the car. Then something happened. She stopped. Her head turned sharply to her right. She was looking toward another vehicle. A white car. The second girl, Claire, wasn't visible in that moment. She may have been inside the station or already sitting in the sedan. Emily watched the white vehicle for several seconds before getting into her car. Then the girls drove away. The white car was still visible. A 1966 Dodge Coronet. White, no license plates. That was the first thing in the case that felt wrong. The second thing was the gas station owner. He kept asking when he would get his tape back. At first, I assumed he was just cheap. Then he asked again and again. You know that's my only tape, right? I told him it was evidence. He nodded. 5 minutes later, he asked when he could have it back. There was something about his urgency that bothered me. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe he simply didn't want to spend money buying another VHS tape. But investigators learn to pay attention to the little things that feel wrong. Why was he so desperate to get that particular recording back? Why had Emily suddenly turned toward the Dodge? Who was she looking at? And why did a man running a gas station in 2007 still use one ancient VH tape for security footage? The universe seemed determined to make the investigation as difficult as possible. The families gave us a photograph taken near the beginning of the trip. Claire and Emily were smiling into the camera, standing beside their car. Young, happy, excited, they looked like two people who believed they had their whole lives ahead of them. I stared at that picture longer than I should have. Two clean souls from Canada came down into our plains and disappeared. What were they looking for out here? Beautiful scenery? Freedom? Adventure? Did they find what they were searching for? Or did something find them first? The Dodge became my best lead. Fortunately, identifying it wasn't difficult. Everyone within 50 kilometers knew that car. It belonged to the Olsen family. Calling them a family wasn't quite right. Clan was closer. The Olsens lived outside town in an isolated settlement surrounded by farmland. They had Scandinavian roots and claimed their ancestors had settled the region long before our town became much of anything. They rarely came into town except when necessary. They didn't socialize. They didn't attend public events. They didn't invite outsiders onto their land. They had relatives and supporters scattered around the area, and over the years they had slowly built something that looked almost like their own private village. Several houses stood along a rough road. Behind them were massive grain silos and metal warehouses. There were barns, storage buildings, sheds, and other structures whose purpose I couldn't guess. From a distance, the whole place looked less like a farm and more like a fortress surrounded by endless corn. If someone had told me a cult lived there, I would have believed them. But technically, the Olsons had never given local police much reason to interfere. They were strange, private, difficult, but not openly violent. Their Dodge Coronet was usually parked near the road. That created another problem. Apparently, almost anyone in the community could use it. The car wasn't treated as one person's property. It belonged to all of them. That meant I couldn't simply identify one driver. There was only one person who might give me answers. Erg Olson. Erg was the unofficial leader of the community. He wasn't officially elected to anything. He didn't carry a title. But everyone knew he spoke for the Olsons. He was easy to describe. He was the kind of man you would never want to meet alone at night. Close to 2 meters tall, probably around 100 kilograms, long hair, a thick beard, broad shoulders, and eyes that always reminded me of a wolf. Not angry eyes. That would have been easier. His eyes were calm, too calm, like an animal watching something it had not yet decided whether to attack. The Olson settlement had never cooperated much with police. They answered questions only when absolutely necessary. Usually, Erg answered for everyone. So I drove out there. The moment my car stopped near the first buildings, the atmosphere changed. People had been working. A few men were carrying equipment. Women stood near one of the houses. Children were outside. The second they noticed the police vehicle, everyone stopped. Not slowly, all at once. It felt as though someone had frozen the entire settlement. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment. Great, another wonderful day. I stepped out, adjusted my coat, checked that my badge was visible, and started walking. Before I made it past the first house, Erg appeared. I still don't know who told him I had arrived. He stood in the road waiting for me. That day, he wore something unusual, a dark cloak or heavy robe wrapped around his shoulders. I had seen him in town several times before and had never seen him wear anything like it. Detective, one word. That was a start. Now I only had to somehow get an entire sentence out of him. He turned and motioned for me to follow. Apparently, we were going for a walk. I followed. Children watched us as we passed. Their faces were expressionless. Their parents looked away when I met their eyes. There was a thickness to the air that I couldn't explain. I had visited hostile homes before. Drug houses. Domestic violence scenes. Places where people openly hated the police. The Olson settlement felt different. No one threatened me. No one shouted. No one even looked angry. They simply watched. I need to know who was at the gas station with the Dodge Coronet, I said. Erg kept walking for another few steps before slowly nodding. He seemed to think about every word before speaking. That car belongs to the community. Of course it did. Who took it to the station? He looked at me. I don't need to remind you that the car doesn't have license plates. Erg stopped. For a moment, I wondered if I had pushed too hard. Standing next to him made me painfully aware of how large he was. If he decided to throw me out, I'm not sure there was much I could have done about it. Then he spoke. The paths of travelers are unpredictable. I stared at him. That wasn't an answer. I'd pulled the photograph of Claire and Emily from my pocket. They were smiling in the picture. I held it toward him. No one saw these girls? Berg looked at the photograph. His expression didn't change. No one invited them here? I asked. He scratched his beard slowly. What a pointless loss, he said. I waited. Then he added, nature gives and nature takes. I remember nodding, mostly because I had no idea how else to respond. What exactly is that supposed to mean? He didn't answer. I tried again. So no one from your community saw them? Erg looked directly into my eyes. I wish he hadn't. His face remained calm, but something in his stare made every instinct in my body come alive. It was the same feeling you get when you realize there's an animal in the dark watching you. I knew he wasn't going to attack me. At least, logically, I knew that. My body didn't believe it. He continued staring. The silence stretched until I finally looked away. That was when I noticed the structure. It was partly hidden between two buildings. At first, I thought it was an old tornado shelter. The entrance was made of brick and led underground. A heavy door stood halfway open. Stone steps disappeared beneath the earth. There was light below. Not electric light. Candlelight. I could see shadows moving across the walls. Something hung from the ceiling. Strings, maybe, small objects made from twigs. For a moment, one shape looked like an enormous spider. Farther back stood what appeared to be a wooden statue. I couldn't make out what it represented. I took one step toward the shelter. Erg lifted his hand. He didn't say anything. One of the Olsen men immediately ran over and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed between the buildings. The man remained in front of the entrance, guarding it. I looked at Erg. What's down there? His expression didn't change. Nothing that would interest you, Carter. Hearing him use my name surprised me. I didn't remember introducing myself. Maybe he knew who I was. In a town this size, that wasn't impossible. Still, I didn't like it. Erg gestured toward my car. The interview was over. He began walking away. People like him are used to others obeying them, and I hated the fact that I did exactly what he expected. If anyone remembers anything, you can call, I said. Erg turned. Several large men were now standing behind him. Brothers, cousins, whatever they were. I had never seen most of them outside the settlement. They were strong men, farm workers, the kind of people whose hands looked capable of breaking things without tools. Sure, Erg said. The word was polite. His tone wasn't. I drove away. Even after I passed the settlement, I still felt as though his eyes were following me. I stopped for coffee on the way back. Then I started digging through old records. When official evidence runs out, desperation sends you toward stories, local legends, rumors, things people laugh about until someone disappears. Every farming town seems to have a story about something living in the corn. Ours was called the Corn Monster. The name was ridiculous. The stories weren't always. Most versions described something wandering through fields at night. Some said it attacked livestock. Some said it followed people. Others claimed it only appeared during bad growing seasons. I didn't believe any of it. But by that point, I was willing to examine anything. I searched missing persons records. One case stood out from 1967. A man from Bowman. The original paperwork was poor, and even his name wasn't clearly preserved in the local records I found. According to witnesses, he had been drinking. He had apparently made a bet that he could walk into a cornfield at night and prove there was nothing supernatural hiding inside it. He was never seen again. 20 years later, in 1987, another incident occurred. A young woman was found dead during harvest. Her body had been hidden among the corn long enough to become heavily decomposed. No identification was ever confirmed. Jane Doe. Then, 2007, Claire Tuns, Emily Hart. 20 years between each event. I stared at the dates. It could have been coincidence. It probably was. But after looking at the numbers long enough, coincidence starts feeling like a pattern. The only clear connection between the cases was location. Cornfields, huge ones, fields stretching for miles. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my face. Jesus Christ, I muttered. None of this makes any sense. How do two people disappear from a straight road? I had driven the route repeatedly. There were hardly any side roads, no tourist attractions, no scenic overlooks, no places where someone would logically stop, just road and corn. Miles and miles of it. Someone should have seen them. A farmer, a trucker, anyone. No one had. Locals kept bringing up the old stories, bad seasons, people disappearing, strange lights in the fields, animals refusing to enter certain areas. I dismissed most of it. Then a new clue appeared. A truck driver named Jack Smith contacted the station. He had found a photograph in the parking lot of the gas station. I was driving through the fields when I got the call. I turned around immediately. When I saw the picture, something inside me changed. It showed Claire and Emily. Based on their clothes, there was no doubt. They were in a cornfield. Burlap sacks covered their heads. Their arms were tied. Their bodies were strapped to something shaped like a cross. The photograph had been taken at night. The camera flash was the only source of light. Corn surrounded them. Endless corn. Their clothes were covered in dirt. There were dark stains that could have been mud. Some looked like blood. I stared at the photograph until another officer told me to sit down. The image didn't prove whether they were alive or dead when it was taken. But it proved something worse. Their disappearance had not been accidental. Someone had taken them. Someone had tied them up. Someone had photographed them. Then, somehow, that photograph ended up at the same gas station where they were last seen. Dropped by accident? Placed deliberately? I didn't know. At that point, I felt like the entire world had turned into corn. Every road I drove passed fields. Every lead pointed toward fields. Every photograph contained stalks. I dreamed about walking through corn at night. Sometimes I dreamed I couldn't find the road. Sometimes I dreamed the ground turned to mud and pulled me down. I started looking worse. People noticed. I drank too much coffee. I slept too little. But the case was finally becoming something. Maybe a ritual. Maybe a cult. The Olsen settlement returned to my mind. The underground room. The candles. The twig figures. Erg saying nature gives and nature takes. Could the girls have been part of some ritual? One case wasn't enough to prove anything. Maybe one fanatic was responsible. That possibility almost felt worse. A single person with no obvious connections would be much harder to find. Then, there was the possibility every detective hates. A serial killer. I checked similar cases across the surrounding counties. Nothing matched. No series of women tied to crosses. No bodies staged in cornfields. No missing travelers connected to white Dodge Coronets. A rage killing didn't fit either. Someone acting in sudden anger doesn't usually take the time to build a cross, tie two victims to it, put sacks over their heads, and take a photograph. This was planned. That was all I knew. I had one terrible VH tape, two photographs, a suspicious old car, a closed community that wouldn't speak, and no bodies. Eventually, I started considering another visit to Erg. The thought actually made me uncomfortable. Our previous conversation may have been the longest discussion Erg Olson had held with an outsider in years. I decided to delay it. Instead, I drove the route from the Olson settlement toward the road the girls should have taken. Again, I drove it until I knew every bend, every ditch, every farmhouse, every tree. There was nowhere for two people and a car to disappear. Yet they had. I stopped sleeping properly. More coffee, more driving, more corn. My chief called me into his office. He told me I looked terrible. He suggested I take medical leave. I refused. A few coworkers told me I was becoming irritable. They were right. I snapped at people, forgot meals, stayed at the station long after everyone else had gone home. I kept staring at the dates. 20 years. Why 20? Why was every case different? Why couldn't I let it go? I didn't have good answers. The case had become personal somewhere along the way. Maybe because Claire and Emily looked so normal in that first photograph. Maybe because their families called every day. Maybe because Erg Olson had looked at their picture and called their disappearance a pointless loss instead of asking what happened. Or maybe I simply couldn't accept that two people could vanish from my county without leaving an answer behind. Then the witness contacted us. He refused to give his name over the phone. He claimed he had information about the missing women. He said he was afraid for his safety. I asked him to come to the station. He refused. I offered a restaurant. No, a public parking lot. No, he chose the meeting place himself. A cornfield. Of course he did. Where else? He wanted to meet at 2 in the morning. Every part of the arrangement felt suspicious. I knew that. I wasn't stupid. But I also believed I was close. Closer than I had been since the investigation began. I told myself the witness might be connected to the Olsons. Maybe someone inside the settlement wanted to talk, but couldn't risk being seen with police. Maybe it was the gas station owner. Maybe the Dodge driver. Maybe someone had seen Claire and Emily after they left Balta. I didn't know. I only knew I had to go. The chief would have told me not to. My coworkers would have insisted on coming with me. So, I didn't tell them. By then, I had become convinced there was something larger behind the disappearance. No one around me understood how badly the case had started eating at me. Every unanswered question felt like something scratching inside my skull. I had to figure it out. I had to move forward. The fields would tell me. At least that's what I believed. The next thing anyone saw was a photograph uploaded from my account. It appeared online without explanation. The image showed me stepping out of my car. My headlights were shining directly toward the camera, so strongly that most of the scene looked completely black. At first glance, it seemed as though I were standing in an empty space. Someone later adjusted the brightness and contrast. The background became visible. Corn tall stalks behind the road. In front of my headlights was a shadow, a human shape. Someone had been standing between my car and the photographer. In the picture, I was crouched slightly forward, apparently trying to see who or what was ahead of me. The photograph contained almost no useful metadata. Most of it had been erased. Only one detail remained. The time, 2:00 a.m., the exact time of my meeting. Detective John Carter was officially declared missing. My notes appeared online 14 days later. Investigators eventually discovered that I had used a delayed posting program. I had apparently set the files to publish automatically if I didn't return and cancel the upload. My vehicle was found in a ditch. It had rolled over and landed partly inside a cornfield. There was no body inside, no useful blood evidence, no sign of Claire Tuns, no sign of Emily Hart, no sign of the person who had contacted me. Police searched the surrounding fields. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers joined. Aircraft searched from above. Nothing. Investigators returned to the Olson settlement. Erg Olson spoke for the community. He claimed neither he nor anyone in the settlement had seen Detective Carter on the night he disappeared. Police questioned him about the Dodge, about the gas station, about the underground shelter, about the missing students. The community offered little cooperation. No evidence strong enough for an arrest was found. The old Dodge Coronet was examined. It produced nothing that could be directly connected to the girls. The gas station owner continued insisting that he didn't know who had been driving it the day Claire and Emily disappeared. He also claimed he had never seen the photograph showing the girls tied to the cross before Jack Smith found it in the parking lot. The fields were searched. Again. Nothing. Years passed. The case went cold. Eventually, the investigation was suspended because there was no new evidence. Claire Tuns remained missing. Emily Hart remained missing. Detective John Carter remained missing. The identity of the person who photographed Carter at 2 in the morning was never discovered. Neither was the person who uploaded the photograph. Some believe the Olson family knew more than they admitted. Others blamed an unknown killer who used the cornfields for privacy. A few locals returned to the old stories. They pointed again to the dates. Every 20 years. They spoke about the man who walked drunkenly into the corn and never returned. The unidentified woman found during harvest. The 2 Canadian students. And finally, the detective who spent his last week saying he felt as though the fields were trying to tell him something. Police never treated those stories seriously. There was no evidence of a monster. No proof of anything supernatural. Only missing people. A photograph. An overturned car. A white Dodge without plates. An isolated community. And thousands upon thousands of acres of corn. The Olson settlement still stands outside town. People still avoid driving near it at night. The old underground structure Carter saw during his visit was later said to be a storage cellar. No police officer was allowed inside without a warrant, and no warrant was ever approved because there was not enough evidence connecting the building to a crime. Erg Olson became even more private after Carter disappeared. On the rare occasions when someone asked him about the detective, he supposedly gave the same answer. The paths of travelers are unpredictable. Most people considered it another strange Olson saying. But there are some who remember what he told Carter about Claire and Emily. Nature gives, and nature takes. Those people don't laugh about the corn monster anymore. They don't walk into the fields after dark. They don't stop their cars on the empty road between Balta and the Olson settlement. And every harvest season, someone checks the old records again. The official files say the cases remain unsolved. Maybe they always will. But the people who live near those fields know something outsiders don't. During certain nights, when the wind is quiet and the corn is tall, you can stand beside the road and hear movement deep inside the stalks. Not the random movement caused by animals, not wind, something slower, something heavy, like footsteps. People say that if you hear them, you should get back into your car. You should lock the doors. You should drive. And whatever happens, you should never follow the sound into the corn. Because the last detective who thought the fields would give him an answer disappeared before sunrise. All that remained was his car, his notes, and a photograph taken by someone who has never been identified. And somewhere in that photograph, hidden between the light of Carter's headlights and the darkness of the corn, a person was waiting for him. Or perhaps it wasn't a person at all. Story 4. Father Gerald pulled the heavy steel door shut behind him and listened to the lock settle into place with a deep metallic click. The room was smaller than he had expected. There were no windows, no religious symbols, and no decoration of any kind. The walls were bare concrete. A single electric light hung from the ceiling, but it was weak enough that it only illuminated the center of the room. Everything beyond that circle of pale light disappeared into darkness. In the middle of the room sat a thin man in a prison uniform. His wrists were secured in front of him, though the guards had removed the heavier restraints at Father Gerald's request. The prisoner sat hunched forward in the metal chair, his shoulders narrow beneath the striped fabric. "Hello, Father," the man whispered. The voice barely sounded human. It came out as a dry, hollow rasp, as though speaking caused him physical pain. Father Gerald gave him a gentle nod. "Hello, my son." He moved closer and took the empty chair opposite him. "I am sorry they would not allow us to meet in the chapel," Gerald continued. "I asked twice, but given the circumstances, they insisted we use this room." The prisoner slowly lifted his head. Father Gerald had read enough of the case to know the man's name, Joshua Hensley. He also knew what Hensley had been accused of: 4 men dead, all found inside Hensley's house. The newspapers had described the crime scene with words like massacre, madness, and ritual. But the man sitting before him did not look capable of killing anyone. Hensley was terribly thin. His skin seemed stretched tightly over his bones. Veins showed clearly beneath his temples and hands. His cheekbones stood out sharply, and his eyes sat so deep in their sockets that most of his face remained hidden beneath shadow. He looked less like a murderer than a man dying from some long illness. Father Gerald placed his hands together in his lap. "I am ready whenever you are, Mr. Hensley," Joshua swallowed. His throat moved painfully. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." He stopped. A long silence followed. Then he looked helplessly at the priest. "I don't know what comes after that." Father Gerald softened his expression. "How long has it been since your last confession?" Joshua gave a weak, embarrassed laugh. "I've never confessed before." "Never?" "I was never religious." Joshua looked down at his hands. "My parents weren't either. I think my mother believed in God in a general kind of way, but we never went to church. I never prayed. I never thought there was anything listening." His eyes rose toward Gerald again. "Now I need to believe something is listening." There was such desperation in the words that Father Gerald felt his expression change before he could stop it. Joshua noticed. The priest was used to hearing confession through a screen where the penitent could not easily read his face. Here, There was nowhere to hide his reaction. Father Gerald quickly regained himself. "What matters is that you asked for me," he said. "Whatever brought you here, you have chosen to speak now. Salvation is not limited only to those who have lived perfect lives." Joshua stared at him. "Even someone like me? That depends on whether you are truly sorry and whether you are willing to confess honestly." Joshua nodded. His eyes were already wet. "May I begin?" "Please." Joshua took a long breath. "Through my actions, I invited something terrible into this world." Father Gerald waited. Joshua continued. "It started with astronomy." The priest frowned slightly, but said nothing. "When I was younger, I never cared about the stars," Joshua said. "They were just lights, pretty things people wrote poems about. Then, one summer, I joined a community astronomy club because I was bored and needed something to do." His breathing steadied as he spoke. "That was where I met John Whitaker." Father Gerald recognized the name. John Whitaker had been one of the dead men. Joshua continued. "The first night John let me use the club's telescope, I thought I was prepared for what I would see. I had looked at pictures before. Everyone has. The moon, Saturn, Jupiter, but photographs aren't the same." His eyes became distant. "Through the telescope, I saw the surface of the moon, not a picture of it. I saw it hanging there. Craters, shadows, mountains, a real place floating in darkness." Joshua's voice grew stronger. "Then, Saturn. Those rings. You can read about how wide they are and what they're made of, but when you see them yourself, something changes inside you." He leaned forward. "I saw Jupiter too. I watched its moons move around it, tiny worlds circling a giant." Father Gerald waited for the confession to reach the crimes. When Joshua paused, he decided to guide him. "I do not mean to interrupt, Miss Hensley, but how does this relate to the sins you wish to confess?" Joshua blinked. "In every way." Father Gerald studied him. Joshua seemed frustrated. "That telescope started everything," he said. "It made me want answers. Knowledge is not sinful." "No," Joshua replied quickly, "but obsession can be." Father Gerald nodded. "Continue." Joshua rubbed his thin hands together. "I started reading. At first it was normal material. Newton, Kepler, Galileo, old philosophers, early theories about the heavens. Then, newer books, relativity, electromagnetism, quantum mechanics." He laughed bitterly. "I understood maybe half of what I read, sometimes much less. But I kept going." His eyes moved toward the ceiling. "I stopped sleeping properly. I missed work. My wife complained that I never listened to her anymore. My son would ask me to play outside, and I'd tell him later." Joshua's face tightened. Later became tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. Father Gerald recognized an opening. "Do you regret neglecting your family?" Joshua nodded. "Yes." "Then say so plainly." "I regret it." His voice cracked. "I regret every hour I spent looking upward when I should have been looking at them." The priest remained silent. Joshua continued. "But even that wasn't the real mistake." "What was?" "Believing there had to be a final answer." Father Gerald said nothing. Joshua stared at the floor. "I became angry with science." The statement surprised the priest. Angry? Not because science was wrong, because it wasn't enough. Joshua looked up. Newton explained how gravity behaved. Later theories explained it better. People could describe motion, mass, time, energy. His voice became more intense. But why? Father Gerald frowned. Why what? Why should matter attract matter at all? Why should time exist? Why should the universe have rules? Why should mathematics fit reality? Joshua leaned closer. Every answer led to another question beneath it. Then another. Then another. His eyes widened. I wanted to reach the bottom. For the first time, Father Gerald felt a small chill. Joshua noticed his reaction. I told John about my frustration. And what did he say? He laughed at first. Joshua smiled weakly at the memory. Then he started bringing me books. What kind of books? Physics at first. Modern cosmology. Things I could barely understand. Joshua swallowed. Then older things. Father Gerald shifted in his chair. How old? Very old. Joshua's voice lowered. Translations, manuscripts, copies of copies. Some had no authors listed. Some were written in dialects I had never seen. The electric light above them gave a faint buzz. Father Gerald glanced upward. Joshua continued. I should have stopped. The light flickered. Once, twice, then it went out. The room dropped into complete darkness. Father Gerald immediately heard Joshua's breathing quicken. Oh, God. Stay calm, Gerald said. I don't like the dark. It is only an electrical problem. No, Joshua whispered. His chair creaked. No, Father, not here. A few seconds later, the bulb flickered back to life. Joshua was visibly trembling. His face had lost what little color it had. Father Gerald leaned forward. Mr. Hensley, perhaps we should focus more directly on what happened. Joshua's fear shifted into something closer to anger. You still don't understand. I am trying to. I have been confessing. Joshua's voice rose. Nobody thinks going to a library is dangerous. Nobody cares if you read one book too many. He pointed toward himself. But then you start ordering books from people who won't give you real names. Then you start translating things that should have stayed untranslated. His breathing became uneven. I read about the plains of Ekni. Father Gerald felt the chill again. I read about lost Gathul. The overhead light flickered rapidly now. I learned about the formless things that live in the void. The electrical hum grew louder. Things that some writings called the Sryths. Father Gerald stared at him. And then, Joshua whispered, I read about the Great Mother. The bulb flashed. For an instant, the entire room was illuminated. Not just the center, the corners, the walls, everything. Father Gerald noticed the electrical controls beside the door. The main switch was clearly in the off position, yet several small indicator lights blinked beneath it. Tiny dials moved by themselves. A low hum came from inside the wall. Father Gerald stood. This light is malfunctioning. Joshua did not respond. Gerald removed a handkerchief from his pocket. Carefully, he reached up and unscrewed the hot bulb. It came free. The room went dark again. Father Gerald lowered the bulb and placed it gently on the concrete floor. Faint clicking continued from the electrical panel. I think I would like to finish, Joshua said from the darkness. Father Gerald slowly sat down again. His hand had moved instinctively toward the rosary in his pocket. Continue, Joshua spoke quietly. When I first read about her, I thought she was mythology. The Great Mother? Yes. What is she? Joshua's breathing changed. I don't know. The answer seemed sincere. Some books called her a goddess. Others called her the first intelligence. One said she existed before matter had shape. Joshua's voice became softer. Another said the stars are only openings through which she watches. Father Gerald gripped his rosary. Joshua gave a weak laugh. You probably think that sounds insane. I think you were reading dangerous ideas while in an unstable state. No, Joshua's answer came too quickly. I was stable until she noticed me. The priest went still. What do you mean? As I learned about her, she learned about me. Joshua began to cry. At first it was dreams. He wiped his face with his shoulder. I would dream that I was floating in space, but there were no planets, no moon, nothing, he swallowed, only stars. His voice dropped, and every star would turn toward me. Father Gerald felt himself whisper part of the Lord's Prayer under his breath. Joshua continued. Then I started hearing her when I was awake. What did she say? She asked questions. What kind? About the others. Others, John, the astronomy club. Joshua shook his head. She wanted me to show them what I had learned. He began rocking slightly in his chair. She wanted us to perform certain calculations, certain rituals. The priest's whispering became more deliberate. Joshua looked toward the darkness where Gerald sat. She told me she could take me beyond the firmament. The clicking from the wall grew louder. Joshua suddenly asked, Do you ever feel the stars watching you? Father Gerald stopped praying. Joshua leaned forward. A million little eyes. His voice trembled, watching every step. Father Gerald refused to answer. Instead, he asked the question that mattered most. Mr. Hensley, how did John Whitaker and the other men die? Silence. Joshua's breathing became shallow. Finally, he whispered. She promised she would make the voice stop. Father Gerald waited. All I had to do was invite her in. On the floor beside them, the disconnected light bulb flickered. Father Gerald looked down. A weak orange glow appeared inside the glass. His breath caught. There were no wires connected to it, no electricity. Yet the filament slowly brightened. Joshua began sobbing. I refused. The light grew stronger. I stopped looking at the sky. Father Gerald rose from his chair. Joshua continued. I covered every window in my house. The bulb became brighter. I stopped going outside at night. Father Gerald stepped toward the door. I burned the books. The bulb flared. I burned every page. Father Gerald reached for the door handle. But she was still there. Joshua's voice broke. I started seeing constellations through the ceiling. Father Gerald froze, through plaster, through wood, through everything. The priest pulled on the door. It did not move. Joshua continued. The stars would shine above my bed. The bulb was now bright enough to illuminate the room again. I knew they weren't stars anymore. Father Gerald pulled harder on the door. It was her looking down. The handle would not turn. Then Joshua said, John came to my house. Father Gerald looked back. He brought 3 others from the club, the same 3 men whose bodies had been found with Whitaker. It was after midnight. Joshua's body trembled violently. They said they had been dreaming too. The bulb became almost painfully bright. John carried papers. Father Gerald turned fully toward Joshua. He had covered them with equations. Joshua started breathing faster. Symbols, drawings, things he said appeared in his dreams. His voice became frantic. I told them to leave. The light hummed. I told them to burn everything. Father Gerald began praying aloud now. Joshua barely seemed to hear. Then, John showed me one page. The bulb flashed. I looked at it. Joshua's eyes widened in terror. and something took hold of me. Father Gerald pulled at the door again. I felt my mind separate from my body. Joshua's voice rose. I could see my hands moving, but I wasn't moving them. The electrical hum became deafening. Something pulled on my tongue. Father Gerald pounded on the steel door. No one answered. I tried to close my mouth. Joshua was screaming now, but she made me speak. The disconnected bulb lifted slightly from the floor. Father Gerald stared. Joshua's voice changed. For one terrible moment, it became deeper, layered as if several mouths were speaking through him. In hunc locum igvitum sufferath. The bulb exploded with white light. Father Gerald covered his eyes. Even with them closed, the brightness burned red through his eyelids. He shouted prayers, the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, anything he could remember. Joshua continued speaking through sobs. The room became bright like this. Father Gerald pushed desperately against the wall where the door should have been. But his hands found only concrete. No handle, no seam, nothing that came through the paper. Joshua screamed. I saw part of it. The temperature rose. Father Gerald smelled something burning. I only looked for 1 second. Joshua's restraints rattled violently. I was the only one strong enough to look away. The priest heard terrible sounds surrounding him. Whispers, clicking, something wet moving across concrete. Joshua screamed louder. John kept looking. Father Gerald continued praying. The others kept looking. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. They started screaming. Joshua's words broke into painful gasps. They tore at themselves. Father Gerald felt movement around his legs. He refused to open his eyes. They scratched their own faces. The prisoner's chair slammed repeatedly against the floor. They pulled at their skin. Father Gerald pushed against the wall again. Something shifted. I tried to stop them. Joshua's voice cracked. I did not kill them. Something brushed Father Gerald's shoulder. It felt impossibly cold. I caused their death. Joshua shouted, his voice distorted. But I did not kill them. The priest felt the wall move beneath his hands. A seam appeared. He pushed harder. The steel door suddenly opened. Father Gerald fell forward onto the corridor floor. Fresh air hit his face. 2 guards shouted. They rushed toward him. Father Gerald threw one hand up. Back. The guards stopped. Father, get back, you fools. Gerald struggled to his feet. His hands shook violently. One of the guards reached for his radio. What happened in there? Father Gerald did not answer. He should have walked away. He should have ordered them to seal the room. He should never have looked back. But he did. And that was his mistake. The light inside the room had changed. It was no longer painfully bright. Now it was soft enough to see through. Joshua Hensley remained strapped to the chair. His entire body was convulsing. Smoke rose from his skin. Black shapes moved around him, not shadows cast by anything in the room. Living darkness. They moved across the floor, climbed the walls, and passed through Joshua's body as though flesh meant nothing to them. Father Gerald saw shapes that almost resembled arms. Faces, wings, then they would collapse into forms his mind could not understand. The guards behind him began whispering. One made the sign of the cross. Something moved beneath Joshua's chair. At first, Gerald thought the concrete was cracking. Then he realized the floor itself had become soft. Dark, deep, it looked less like a hole and more like a piece of the night sky had opened beneath the prisoner. Stars appeared within it, thousands of them, too many. And every one of those stars seemed to be getting larger. Closer, Father Gerald suddenly understood what Joshua had meant. They looked like eyes. Joshua slowly lifted his head. For the first time since the confession began, he was no longer crying. His expression was calm, almost relieved. His eyes found Father Gerald. The black things around him became still. Then Joshua smiled. Father Gerald felt every instinct inside him scream to run. Joshua opened his mouth. When he spoke, the voice was his own again. Soft, weak, almost peaceful. Father Gerald gripped the rosary until the beads dug into his palm. Joshua's smile widened. I think she heard my confession. The darkness beneath the chair opened wider. Something enormous began to rise. Joshua gave the priest one final look. Then he whispered his last words. And now she knows your name. Story 5. Yesterday, at exactly 12:12 in the morning, I received a phone call while I was asleep. I still remember the time, because when I finally opened my eyes and looked at the screen, those 4 numbers seemed burned into my mind. 12:12. The phone had been vibrating beside me for several seconds before I fully woke up. At first, I thought the sound was part of a dream. I had been sleeping deeply, and the room was completely dark except for the weak light coming from my phone screen. The number calling me was not saved in my contacts. I did not recognize it. I only remember the last digits clearly. 667-3178. I stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. I have a personal rule about unknown numbers. If I do not have someone saved in my contacts, especially if they are calling after midnight, I usually do not answer. If it is important, they can leave a message or call again. Nobody should be calling at 12:12 in the morning without a reason. I waited. The phone remained silent. I placed it back beside me and tried to close my eyes again, but something about the call bothered me. Maybe it was the time. Maybe it was the fact that the number looked unfamiliar. Or maybe I simply did not like waking up to someone trying to reach me while the whole house was asleep. For a moment, I wondered if it could have been the delivery driver. I had an order coming soon, and I thought perhaps the driver had called to tell me when it would arrive. Still, it would have been very strange for a delivery driver to call after midnight. I checked my notifications. There was no message, no voicemail, nothing. I told myself it was probably a wrong number. People make mistakes. Someone could easily enter one wrong digit and accidentally call a stranger in the middle of the night. I should have left it alone. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I had another cell phone nearby, so I decided not to call the number back from the phone that had received the call. I do not know exactly why I did that. Maybe I thought using another phone would somehow make me safer. At the time, it seemed reasonable. Now, I wish I had never called. I took the second phone, copied the unknown number, and pressed the call button. It rang. Once, twice, then someone answered. A man. Hello? His voice was quiet. Not sleepy, not angry, just quiet. I hesitated for a second before speaking. Hello, who are you, and why did you call my other number? There was a pause, a strange pause. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer. Then the man answered. I'm sorry. That was all he said at first. I waited. Did you call me by mistake? I asked. Yes, he said. I'm sorry. I dialed the wrong number. His explanation should have ended the whole thing. Wrong number. Simple mistake. Nothing unusual. I almost hung up. Then he added something. I'm sorry. I didn't want to cause any problems or harm to your family. I froze. I remember sitting completely still on the edge of my bed, holding the second phone against my ear. What? He did not explain. I tried to convince myself I had heard him wrong. Maybe he had said something else. Maybe he had been speaking too quietly. But I knew what I had heard. He had apologized for calling the wrong number. Then he had apologized for causing problems or harm to my family. That was not a normal thing to say. Still, I did not want to sound afraid. So I said, okay, that's fine. I expected him to say goodbye. He didn't. I also did not hang up immediately. For some reason, both of us remained on the line. There was almost complete silence. I could hear a faint sound from his side of the call. Breathing, maybe, or static. Then he spoke again. Sorry, I said nothing. Sorry, another pause. Sorry, I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear. Then he continued. Sorry, 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 sorry. His voice did not change. He was not crying. He was not laughing. He just kept repeating the same word in almost exactly the same tone. Sorry, again, sorry, again, sorry. It started to sound less like an apology and more like a recording or a warning. I hung up. My hands were shaking by then. I immediately blocked the number on the phone I had used to call him. Then I picked up my main phone and blocked the number there too. I checked both phones twice to make sure. Blocked, I tried to calm myself down. It was just some strange person. Maybe someone who was drunk. Maybe someone playing a prank. Maybe someone with some kind of problem. There were 100 normal explanations. I repeated those explanations in my head until I almost believed them. Then I went back to bed. The house was quiet. My father was sleeping in another room. He had been drinking earlier and was probably deeply asleep. Outside, everything seemed normal. No cars, no voices, no movement. I pulled the blanket over myself and tried to forget the call. That was when I heard the first noise from the backyard. It was very soft, just a small sound, a scrape. I opened my eyes. My room was close to the backyard, so sounds from outside were usually easy to hear. I stayed still and listened. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a cat. Or the wind. Maybe a branch had moved against something. I closed my eyes. Then it came again. Scrape. This time it was longer. Something seemed to drag across the ground. I sat up. The backyard had been completely silent before the phone call. I knew that because I had fallen asleep without hearing anything unusual. Now, suddenly, there were noises. I listened carefully. Something moved outside, not fast. Slow, a few steps. Then silence. Then another sound near the wall. I could not tell whether it was coming from the ground, the fence, or somewhere closer to the house. My heart began beating faster. I thought about getting up and looking through the window, but I did not. Something inside me told me not to. I was already scared from the call. I knew that if I looked outside and saw nothing, I would probably feel better. But there was another possibility. What if I looked outside and saw someone looking back? That thought kept me in bed. A few minutes later, the neighborhood dogs started barking. One dog first, then another, then several. They were not giving the occasional bark dog sometimes make at night. They were going crazy. The barking moved from one house to another, almost as though something was traveling through the area and each dog noticed it as it came closer. I could hear growling mixed with the barking. Then the noises in my backyard became clearer. Something knocked against the fence. I stopped breathing for a moment. A second knock. Then, a scraping sound. I pulled the blanket closer around myself. I wanted to believe an animal had gotten into the yard, maybe a large dog, maybe a raccoon, anything normal. But I could not shake the memory of the man's words. I didn't want to cause any problems or harm to your family. Why would someone say that? Why mention my family? He had supposedly dialed the wrong number. He did not know me. At least, he should not have known me. I started praying. I am not ashamed to admit it. At that moment, I did not know what else to do. I whispered prayers quietly while staring into the darkness of my room. The sounds continued. Something moved behind the house. Sometimes it sounded close to my window, other times farther away. I heard what sounded like footsteps, then something like fingernails scratching against a hard surface. Then silence again. The silence was almost worse than the sounds. Every time things became quiet, I imagined that whatever was outside had stopped moving because it was listening. Maybe it was standing near my window. Maybe it knew I was awake. I kept praying. Then something happened inside the house. A plate fell. The sound exploded through the silence. I nearly screamed. I heard it hit the floor somewhere near the kitchen. Then the sharp sound of breaking ceramic. Pieces scattered across the floor. I sat completely frozen. There should not have been anyone in the kitchen. My father was asleep. I was in my room. Nobody else should have been moving around. I stared toward my bedroom door. It was closed. I suddenly wished I had locked it. For several seconds, I considered getting up. I could lock the door. I could call my father. I could turn on the lights. But my legs felt weak. I did not want to make noise. I did not want whoever or whatever might be inside the house to know exactly where I was. I reached slowly for my phone. My first thought was to call my dad. Then I remembered he was in his room, sleeping, drunk. Even if I called him, he might not wake up. And if he did wake up and came out into the hallway, I was suddenly terrified something might happen to him. The man's words returned again. I didn't want to cause any problems or harm to your family. I stared at my father's contact on the screen. My thumb hovered over the call button. I did not press it. Instead, I kept praying. A few moments later, there was a crash in the living room. It sounded like a piece of furniture had fallen over. Something heavy. Maybe a chair. Maybe a small table. I covered my mouth with one hand. The dogs outside were still barking. Something was happening in the backyard. Something was happening inside the house. And somehow, in my terrified mind, all of it seemed connected to that phone call. I checked the time. It was not much later than when I had first answered the unknown number. I remember thinking that only a small amount of time had passed. It felt like hours. The house made another sound. A creak. Then something bumped against a wall. I listened for footsteps inside, for breathing, for the sound of someone opening a door. Nothing. Then from outside came another scrape. I wanted morning to come. I have never wanted daylight so badly in my life. There is something about darkness that makes every fear grow. In daylight, the backyard was only a yard. The living room was only a room. The hallway was only a hallway. But at that moment, everything felt dangerous. Every dark corner seemed to hide someone. Every shadow looked slightly wrong. Every sound felt deliberate. I kept telling myself that the sun would rise eventually. I just had to make it until then. I prayed. I do not know how many times I repeated the same words. Probably hundreds. At some point, I became exhausted. Fear can wear you down. Your body can only stay completely alert for so long before it starts giving up. My eyes kept closing. I would jerk awake whenever I heard another sound, then close them again. The dogs slowly became quieter. Or maybe I simply stopped noticing them. I do not remember exactly when I fell asleep. I only remember opening my eyes again and seeing daylight. For a few seconds, I had no idea what had happened. Then, I saw the time. 7 a.m. morning, sunlight was coming into the room. I sat up quickly. Everything from the night before returned to me. The call, the man, the apologies, the backyard noises, the plate, the crash in the living room. I stayed in bed for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. Normal morning quiet. No barking, no scraping, no footsteps. I got up slowly. My bedroom door opened without any problem. I stepped into the hallway. Nothing was waiting there. I called out for my dad. No answer. For a second, panic returned. Then I heard him moving in his room. He was alive. That gave me enough courage to continue. I walked toward the kitchen. The first thing I noticed was the broken plate. Pieces were scattered across the floor, exactly where I had heard them fall during the night. That meant I had not dreamed it. I stood staring at the pieces. I did not understand how the plate had fallen. It had not been near the edge of the counter the previous evening. At least, I did not think it had. Then I looked around the kitchen. Things were out of place. A chair had moved. One of the cabinets was open. A few objects were on the floor. I felt cold despite the morning sunlight. Then I went into the living room. It was worse. Everything looked disturbed. A piece of furniture had fallen over.